Well, welcome everyone, and thanks for coming along to our talk today. And if there is an alarm, please don't, well, you can go that way down to the stairs, and you can go that way, and the assembly point is on the quay next door to the pontoons. But I'd be very surprised if there was an emergency, but I have to say those kinds of things. I think as over lunch with Pat, I think it used to be called, I haven't heard it said much recently, it used to be called housekeeping. The next talk in a fortnight, obviously because of the government's recent announcement, or become official on Tuesday, I guess, there won't be a talk in 2 weeks here on, that would have been the Savages, Mr. and Mrs. Savage talking about Napoleon and how he pillaged artworks from around Europe. But it is, Rebecca's invited them in to speak, to be filmed, to speak online. So if you keep a watch out on our website, and I think Rebecca's going to contact you anyway, you'll be told when it's available. So that talk will be available online. So that should be okay, shouldn't it? And I'd like to, at least we've got 3 of the 4. And 1st of November, the Sandringham Church's Pat Knight's, I've known for some time, lives on London Road, and Pat is a Norfolk artist, and she has a background in diplomacy. I have been to one of her talks on her diplomatic career, and also journalism. And she was, until retirement, a magistrate in the borough. And so it's very good that Pat has taken the trouble to come along this afternoon. We enjoyed a lunch together, so Pat has already consumed her speaker's fee, which was, I think, a fish platter. It's been nice. It's good to have Pat here. It's a subject I don't recall us having any similar subject before, so I'd like you to welcome Pat Knights, and the title of the talk is The Sandringham Churches. Thank you, Pat.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Paul. And thank you all for coming. It's lovely to see you. Now, you will not be surprised to hear, perhaps, that under normal circumstances, thousands of visitors from all over the world pop into Sandringham Church every year. And this is because it is just a short walk from Sandringham House, which is one of, if not the main attraction for tourists to Norfolk from April to September. For many years, Sandringham has been synonymous with Christmas Day, when Her Majesty the Queen and her family are recorded walking through the much photographed 160-year-old Lich Gate as they leave the church after attending morning service. Hundreds of people, young and old, will have arrived early to line the short route from the house's garden perimeter in order to catch sight of, or even speak to, the royal family members walking to and from the church, while Her Majesty does the short journey in the warmth and comfort of her chauffeur-driven Bentley. While the church is full of reminders of its close association with the royal family, it is not actually owned by the Queen, though it has been worshipped in by successive monarchs since Queen Victoria bought Sandringham House in 1862 for her son, the Prince of Wales, later Edward VII. Sandringham Church heads the Sandringham group of parishes, which include neighbouring West Newton, Wolverton, Hillington, Flitcham and Castle Rising, all under the jurisdiction of the Diocese of Norwich. During the several weeks that the Queen is in residence, she will also visit the West Newton Church of St Peter and St Paul for the annual prize giving to the choristers and children of the Sunday School, who will also perform a small play which Her Majesty greatly enjoys. Each year she will also worship in rotation at one of the other churches in the parish group. these churches have their own histories and defining features, of which more later. It is the Church of St Mary Magdalene at Sandringham that is the big draw, and deservedly so. This special church has that rare combination of warmth and wow factor. But it didn't start out that way. Its origins go back to the early 14th century. It was demolished and rebuilt in the 16th by William Cobbs, whose grave plaque is on the wall in the south porch. And it was restored in 1855 by Lady Harriet Cowper, whose husband, the Honourable Charles Spencer Cowper, owned the building and Sandringham Hall, as it was then called. Sandringham Church has been described as the most attractive parish church in the country. The main building material is of sandstone, known locally as cast stone, which was quarried at nearby Wolferton. The roof is of English oak and was replaced on the instructions of George V. Sadly, there is no image of the first church on this site, but I do have these undated prints of pen and ink drawings showing the present church before the transepts and chancel porch were added in 1890. So, what gives this Grade 2 listed church with a top capacity of only 172 persons its wow factor? It is undoubtedly the skill and artistry that has gone into the silversmithing of the altar, the reredos, the pulpit, and processional cross. Then there are the stunning stained glass windows, the memorials of royal likenesses, mainly by Sir William Reed Dick, in particular those of George V and Queen Mary. The intricate carving of dozens of angels and other figures in the chancel. The J.W. Walker organ with its outer case designed by Sir Arthur Blomfield. The painted and carved decoration of the chancel walls and roof. The carved figures on the royal pews, and the exquisite aluminium and ivory statuette of St. George and his slain dragon, designed by Sir Alfred Gilbert, which guards the Queen's pew and was given by the royal household in memory of Albert, Duke of Clarence, Edward VII's firstborn child, who died of pneumonia at Sandringham in 1892, aged just 28. A second cast of St. George was placed above his tomb in Windsor Castle. I will go into further detail about these features, but a note first about Sir Alfred Gilbert. Such was his reputation and the demands on himself, as well as by others, including the Prince of Wales, that the Prince's equerry, General Sir Dighton Probyn, wrote to the artist and sculptor, quote, "For heaven's sake, give up those 22-hour stretches of work. You will kill yourself. Ha! Let the people grumble. Tell them to go to the devil." Unquote. Now imagine the poor man saying that to the Prince of Wales. Nevertheless, Gilbert lived to be 80. Having survived early fame, followed by bankruptcy and scandal and 25 years of self-imposed exile. His tomb for the Duke of Clarence is reckoned to be one of our greatest works of art, but it is what caused Gilbert to become bankrupt. Now note here in this photograph some of the many royal memorial plaques designed by Sir William Reed Dick. The stunning stained glass windows include 14 smaller images of saints, often tortured and put to death in horrific ways. Those among the main windows on the north and south side of the nave were manufactured in nearby King's Lynn, and during the period of 1512 to 1520, when the church was being rebuilt. In the south window, we have saints Erasmus, Agnes the Virgin, Stephen, Francis of Rome, Eugenius, or Giles as he is better known, and Apollonia. In the north window, we have Saints Leonard, Vincent, Margaret of Antioch, Bridget of Sweden, Ignatius, also of Sweden, and St. Michael the Archangel. The remaining two, St. Catherine of Alexandria and St. Etheldreda, are to be found in the south porch. It is comforting to think that these tortured souls who suffered so much for their faith hundreds of years ago have been immortalized in such a beautiful way, to be noted, albeit quite high up, by generations to come for as long as the church remains intact. Easier to see are the large lights below of elaborate medieval scenes in subdued colours. Now, if you are wondering why I have not included images of these windows, it is because I hope you will be inspired that one day, in normal circumstances, you will be able to visit the church and see them for yourself. The main east window, featuring the crucifixion, was designed by William Tower and made by Charles Eamer Kemp, who lived between 1837 and 1907. He was a prolific stained glass window designer and manufacturer, with around 4,000 pieces of his work decorating cathedrals and churches, both in Britain and abroad. Heaton and Butler, whose long partnership lasted until the 1950s, and who often worked together with Clayton and Bell. But it is Heaton and Butler who are credited with one of my favourite windows in the south transept. It is a vibrant three-light window depicting the draught of fishes, walking on the water, and the calming of the stone, which was installed in 1891 in celebration of the 50th birthday of the Prince of Wales and presented by his naval officer brother, Alfred, the Duke of Edinburgh. One centre light on the north side of the nave, which particularly fascinates me, is the collection of fragmented Flemish glass damaged in the mid-1660s period of the Civil War when the window was removed. Under the auspices of General Sir Dighton Probyn, VC mentioned earlier, the pieces were reassembled by the architect Sir Arthur Blomfield. Figures that are identifiable include the Judgment of Solomon, the Virgin and Child, Saints Giles and Catherine, and down at the bottom, on the right-hand side, a nimmed figure with a carpenter's set square, which could be representing Joseph, and or a tribute, I like to think, to the unsung craftsmen who worked on these wonderful buildings. In the chancel, there are memorial windows to the infant Prince John, the sixth child born to Alexandra and Edward, who died at Sandringham in 1871 and is buried in the churchyard. And also to Colonel Grey, equerry to the Prince of Wales, and to the Reverends William Onslow and George Moxon, who between them served as successive rectors for over 50 years. These memorials are also the work of Heaton and Butler. But perhaps it is the gifts from the American philanthropist Rodman Wanamaker, who lived from 1863 to 1928, that catch the visitor's eye first, and when we hear an audible "wow" as they look across the nave to the chancel. Wanamaker, about whom more shortly, was a great admirer of Edward VII and his efforts in the cause of peace. Following the king's death in 1910, Wanamaker presented Queen Alexandra with the solid silver altar and reredos, over which he hoped that prayers would be constantly offered for the peace of all nations. Now the story goes that it took Barkington and Kroll of London 5 years to make something similar, which Wanamaker had commissioned as a memorial to his late wife to be placed in their church in Philadelphia. When it was ready to be shipped to America, he showed it to Alexandra. They were old friends, and he had been a guest at Sandringham. We can imagine what her reaction must have been to see such a stunning piece of silversmithing. But it must have given Wanamaker the idea of commissioning a similar set, but with a difference in the detail, as his memorial to the late king, whom he greatly admired. This time, Barkington and Kroll took just 10 months to complete the work to enable it to be installed in Sandringham Church a year to the day after Edward died. Carl Christopher Kroll, the designer, has signed the 6-foot-long altar at the bottom on the left-hand side. With a table of grey fossil granite, the whole piece weighs a ton, literally. The reredos is a copy of a 15th century Florentine work by Antonio del Poleolo, entitled Christ Appearing Among His Disciples. At the base is the inscription, "To the glory of God and in memory of Edward VII, the Peacemaker." The royal arms adorn the front of the altar, supported on either side by kneeling angels. Wanamaker followed up this magnificent solid silver combination with gifts of a jewelled Bible, silver-gilt diamond and ruby-studded communion plate, altar rails embellished with silver angels, and an exquisite silver Spanish processional cross said to be over 500 years old, which Alexandra had placed in the church as a memorial to the 16 men from the estate who died at Gallipoli in World War I. Then, in 1924, in a further act of generosity to mark Alexandra's 80th birthday, he donated the oak pulpit set with silver panels depicting an elongated figure of Christ and scenes from our Lord's ministry. This was designed by Walter Stoy of Barkington and Crowell, who has succeeded Crowell on his death in 1923. Sadly, the Queen died the following year before it was consecrated in 1926 in the presence of King George V and Queen Mary. Silver angels kneel at the foot of the pulpit steps. Wanamaker was born on the 13th of February 1863 and died on the 9th of March 1928. We are told that he was a quiet man who avoided the press and gave strict orders for his biographers to keep him out of the limelight. He was educated at Princeton and spent 10 years living abroad, mainly in France. He loved beautiful and unusual things and influenced his father's department stores to sell nothing that was not. Throughout his life, he was a great patron of the arts, music, sport, and aviation on a grand scale. The enormous organ, which dominated the 12-storied atrium in his father's Philadelphia department store, was enlarged more than once by Rodman until it boasted 28,500 pipes. It is, unsurprisingly, the largest in the world. The first time it was played in public coincided with the 1911 coronation of King George V and Queen Mary, and it has been a major attraction ever since and is regularly enjoyed by thousands at free concerts. His father John, the son of a bricklayer, built up the business, which included department stores in New York and Paris, and on his death left Rodman in sole charge. On Rodman's premature death at the age of 65, the business was run by a trust and eventually became Macy's, which will be more familiar to modern-day shoppers. Rodman's life was, on the one hand, a long list of philanthropic projects, gifts, interests and achievements, and on the other, blighted by being widowed early with 3 young children. His second marriage ended unhappily and he had a debilitating kidney disease during the last 8 years of his life. Like the rest of the artistry in this church, the Royal Memorials are the work of leading artists and craftsmen of their time, notably Sir William Reed Dick, and there are 14 memorials in all. Outside, the graveyard contains close to 200 graves and interments. The oldest grave is attributed to the Reverend Thomas Stringer, rector of Sandringham Church for 32 years, from 1664 to 1696. Members of the host family, who once owned the previous Sandringham Hall, are buried there, and more recently Lady Fermoy, Princess Diana's maternal grandmother, and close friend of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, alongside Lord Fermoy and Diana's brother John Spencer, who died at birth on the 12th of January 1960. Also outside is the Greek font at the west end of the church by the tower, and this is a most unusual and interesting font, probably brought back from the island of Rhodes by the then Duke of Edinburgh in 1886 for his brother, the Prince of Wales. It is thought to date from the 9th century and is hewn out of a solid block of marble about 5 foot long, 3 foot high and 3 foot wide. In ancient Greece, baptisms were by total immersion. Around the upper rim is an inscription which reads, "In the treasury ship of Styliacus a deacon and Calvinus the humble, this work is executed." There are 2 other known examples, one a font of the 4th century, excavated at Tyre, almost exactly the same, only larger, and one in the Museum of Antiquities in Istanbul. The clock was made by Juno Walker of London between 1840 and 1880. Unfortunately, King Edward's private correspondence was destroyed on his death, some of which may have related to this item. It was installed as a memorial to Christopher Sykes MP, a friend of the Prince of Wales. It is hand-wound in the tower, and there are 3 bells cast by John Warner of London, whose hammers are mechanically operated through the clock mechanism. 2 small bells cast in 1899 strike the quarter hours, and the large bell cast in 1897 strikes the hours. The tower does not have a peal of bells and is not open to the public. The present organ was made by J.W. Walker and Sons, with Sir Arthur Blomfield designing the case. It was the last gift of King Edward to the church in 1909, installed just 9 months before he died. It has 3 manuals and is electronically blown. The speckled pipes along the front are partly made of pewter and are, unusually, the sound pipes, not just for decorative purposes. It used to be that due to the organ being situated directly above the boiler house, it was occasionally necessary to boil a kettle in the loft to maintain humidity, but apparently that is no longer necessary. Note the diamond-shaped hatchments over the baptistry, which I will talk about shortly. This organ replaced an earlier one, also built by Walker and also given by Edward 30 years earlier in 1879 when he was Prince of Wales, according to this drawing. We have a very rough sketch of an even earlier instrument, tiny in comparison, which was built by Bishop and Stawell in 1866 and gifted by Queen Victoria. Now, in those early years, Sandringham was a hive of activity. The house was demolished and rebuilt, the churches were being restored, and later, as I mentioned earlier, additions were made to Sandringham Church. Looking at another old picture of number 2 organ, this time a photo, it is evident that enormous improvements have been made to the church over the years, transforming it into the beautiful building it is today, and we can thank Edward for that. It is thought, by the way, that his mother bought the house for him to distract him from the dizzy, scandalous life he was leading in London and elsewhere. Well, judging by the gallery of notables who were guests at the house, the dizzy life was simply transferred to Norfolk. Apparently, Sandringham has more royal memorials than any other parish church, spanning the period between when the estate came into the royal possession in 1862 to the death of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, in 2002. I wouldn't mind betting that it also has more angels, carved, painted and otherwise, within its highly decorated and memorial hung walls. A former rector wrote in the 1970 guidebook that there are 84 of them in the chancel alone, which must mean that the total could be well over 100. The first one the visitor might spot is the slightly damaged angel holding a baby in a niche above the main porch. My favourite angels are the 14 beautifully carved angels of the angel choir in the chancel, each holding a different musical instrument. they were also part of the exquisite memorial to Edward, organised by Alexandra, which was completed in 1920. The hatchments bearing the royal arms above the font and memorial window were placed on the outside of the railway coaches that bore the coffins of George V and George VI from Wolverton Station to London after they had lain in the church overnight, guarded by workers of the estate. A brass cross let into the floor of the chancel marks the spot where the coffin stood, and it is traditional that it should not be walked over. Fixed to the south transept arch is the articulated lectern, from which the lessons are read by members of the congregation, and which can be swiveled in such a way to allow the priest in his stall around the corner to read the gospel when appropriate. Above the door in the south porch is a brass tablet to the memory of Mr. Christopher Sykes. It says, quote, "In memory of Christopher Sykes, born 10 January 1831, died 15 December 1898, who, as a visitor to Sandringham, frequently worshipped in this church. A clock has been placed in the adjoining tower by the Prince of Wales and other sorrowing friends," unquote. Well, this seemingly innocuous memorial hides a shocking story about the behaviour of the Prince's fast set, which I say a little more about in my talk on the royals at Sandringham. Finally, a word about the volunteer stewards who enable the church to be open to visitors for 6 months of the year between April and September, and who love to pass on their knowledge of its history and its many beautiful features. By the way, what do you think is the question most asked of the stewards? Well, I'll tell you, it's, where does the Queen sit? Then there are the other members of the congregation who help to raise much needed funds by serving refreshments on Sandringham Flower Show Day in July, arrange flowers, and help in many other ways, just like other members of churches up and down the country. It is a privilege to be part of this close-knit community in such lovely surroundings with its royal connections. So come and see us next time you are in the area. So now we go on to the other Sandringham churches. When Edward, Prince of Wales, and Princess Alexandra took over Sandringham Estate in 1862, they will have found several medieval churches in need of imaginative and dedicated restoration and care. And it is to their enormous credit, their benefactors' generosity, and the skill of the leading artists, architects, and designers they engaged, that 5 of these medieval village churches, Sandringham, West Newton, Wolverton, Hillington, and Flitcham, have not only survived in working order, but become repositories of beautiful works of art. In doing so, the churches have ensured that the local communities they serve have stayed centred and intact. Castle Rising Church, the 6th member of the Sandringham group of parishes, was restored by the Howard family, and more about all of these shortly. There were 2 other churches, Babingley and Appleton, but they had been abandoned long since, and their tiny villages had virtually disappeared. Churches that have become crumbling, overgrown ruins are not a pretty sight, except to artists, who are often drawn to their sad, decaying beauty, myself included. When I draw a building, I am on intimate terms with every brick, stone, and window frame, much as a builder would be. When a church is a ravaged skeleton of broken walls and arches covered in rampant ivy, it speaks of a purpose that is no more, once loved but long since abandoned. The English artist John Piper, who died in 1992, painted many ruined churches, giving them a haunted quality. Babingley was one he painted in the 1980s. My late husband, who grew up on the Sandringham estate, said that the locals believed Babingley Church was often used by the devil worshippers, but I am not sure what the evidence of that was. The Babingley Church, dedicated to St Mary and St Felix, was situated a mile from the main road, with only a path for access. When a plan to restore it came to nothing, it was decided in 1880 to have a small mission chapel erected near to the road, except that little provision was made for any useful parking. So this pretty little chapel, made of corrugated iron with a smart thatched roof, which was manufactured by a firm in Norwich, known for its corrugated structures in kit form, and which later went on to make small aircraft, it too became redundant and is now in the care of the British Orthodox Church, which has half a dozen other such churches in its care in East Anglia. In spite of the lack of parking, there is a small sign pointing to the car park. Just the one car, perhaps? As might be observed, this is normal for Norfolk. The other church ruin on the estate is that of St Mary at Appleton. Appleton House was once the home of Edward's daughter, Princess Maud, who was married to Prince Karl of Denmark. Their son, Alexander Edward Christian Friedrich, was born in the house on the 2nd of July 1903, but was given the name Olaf when his father became King Haakon VII of Norway in 1905. Olaf V succeeded him in 1957 and died in 1991, the last surviving grandchild of Edward and Alexandra. Appleton House was demolished in 1984, much to the dismay of my husband, who had worked on the house during the war and wanted to show it to me. A recent visitor discovered a 13th century coffin lid beneath the undergrowth within the ruins of the church. My husband used to say that he remembered being told that someone important was buried there. There is a gravestone for Agnes Paston with a Latin inscription and the date of her death as 1676. She was the daughter of a Sir John Sydenham of Somerset. I recently found a report written in the early 1800s which talks of Appleton Hall, presumably a manor house, which was built in 1596 and burnt to the ground in 1767, taking its sleeping occupants, descendants of Agnes Paston, to their graves had they not been woken in time by a local shepherd. This visitor also reported another sorry tale, in that he found horses chained together in the porch and in the church, which had no door, all in a filthy condition. A holy well nearby, fed by a spring, is also recorded, so called because it was on the medieval pilgrimage route to Walsingham, the Catholic shrine about 20 miles away. Vicars serving Appleton are also recorded from 1310 to 1705. On a more positive note, the church ruins have recently been tidied up thanks to a grant from Historic England and the Norfolk Churches Trust. While we still have Babingley fresh in our minds, it should be remembered that both Babingley and Flitchen lay claim to having been founded by St Felix of Burgundy, who had been requested by the royal family of East Anglia to come and evangelise the local population. The Babingley village sign records the legend that St Felix was rescued from drowning by a colony of beavers. As his ship was caught in a storm at the mouth of the River Babingley, now not much more than a stream. He duly made the chief beaver a bishop in thanks. The mind boggles. And this is carved into each successive Babingley village sign, and there have been at least 3 to my knowledge. The first having been made in Princess Alexandra's carving school at Sandringham. Another was carved by Harry Carter, the nephew of Howard Carter, the Egyptologist, who discovered Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922. Both Carters were born in the Norfolk market town of Swaffham. Howard Carter was trained by another eminent Egyptologist, Sir William Flinders Petrie, whose wife was painted by Henry Holiday of the Pre-Raphaelite School of Artists, who designed windows for Heaton, Butler and Bain, who did work for Sandringham Church during Prince Edward and Princess Alexandra's early years at Sandringham House. How's that for a full circle? Flitcham, like Appleton and West Newton, is listed in the Domesday Book of 1086. Besides the Felix connection, its name is either a corruption of Felix or came from the word flitches, as in flitches of bacon. That is, according to Domesday, the place where bacon is produced, or to put it another way, the piece of woodland in the area that supported 27 pigs. The nave and the south aisle of St Mary the Virgin were almost entirely rebuilt in the 19th century, and the royal family took on further restoration in the 20th. The original north transept has gone, but part of the south has been retained as a ruined appendage. The font, with its somewhat squat cover, dates from the 1800s, and I gather came from Sandringham, although I have seen an old photo showing a much taller structure. But maybe the font covers came and went much like the organs. Edward also gave the benches as part of the 1907 refurbishment. The two pairs of painted angels holding the words of the hymn "Crown Him with Many Thorns," which flank the tower arch, also came from Sandringham. I featured only one pair on this card, which I included in a set of 10 I designed for a Festival of Angels in King's Lynn back in 2012. The absence of any stained glass windows give this small church a light and peaceful feeling. The small organ is a Walker model and cost £200 when it was installed in 1909 and paid for by Edward. My husband used to play on it, the operative word being play, I think, when he was a boy, as he only had the benefit of piano lessons, albeit from one Handel Wright, who did play the organ at the Methodist Chapel in King's Lynn. But that's another story. Suffice to say that the lessons took place in Handel's home in Lynn, which eventually became our home and where I still live. The Hillington Church of St Mary has 15th century origins, with restoration dating from 1824. It is predominantly white and bright, with 2 stained glass windows at the east and west ends. The west window of Christ with St Peter is dated 1840 and was made by Wilmshurst and Oliphant. The other window, depicting the adoration of the shepherds and the Magi, is the work of Hardman and Company. There are several elaborate memorials, 2 for Sir William Brown and his wife, curiously signed Sir W.B.A. Arquette, implying that he was an architect, whereas he was president of the Royal College of Physicians. However, whatever his input, the work is that of a renowned sculptor, Joseph Wilton of London, who had studied both in France and Italy for several years, and was one of the founding members of the Royal Academy. He produced a prodigious number of busts and monuments of the great and the good for Westminster Abbey, the V&A, and elsewhere. Alas, when all was going well, he inherited in 1768 his father's fortune, and somehow his talent for sculpting gave way to a talent for spending, and 18 years later he was forced to sell most of his possessions and his own collection before eventually being declared bankrupt. However, he was able to keep his post as keeper of the Royal Academy until his death in 1803. By far, the most outstanding work of art in this church is the exquisitely carved life-size marble monument of Lucretia Georgiana Brown West, cradling her dead infant, who had died just a few hours after his birth. Lucretia was married to Sir Edward West, the Attorney General in Bombay, India, who, like his wife, had been brought up in Hillington Hall, demolished in 1956, close to Flitcham. She was also the sister of Sir William Ffoulkes MP, who owned the land on which our house in King's Lynn was built in 1826, and a copy of whose will is curiously included in our deeds. Although the will laid out plans for the next 1,000 years, the Ffoulkes family died out, which just goes to show that we cannot predict the future and shouldn't try. So much for the background to this already sad story. 11 days after the death of her infant son in Poona, Lucretia herself died, having just a short time before been widowed when Sir Edward died, aged 45, of unrecorded causes. They left an orphaned daughter, aged 2 years. This memorial was the work of another master, Humphrey Hopper, born in 1765 and died in 1844. He too was a prolific sculptor, and in 1814 was commissioned to make a memorial for St. Paul's Cathedral of General Andrew Hay, who was killed in the Battle of Bayonne in France just as the Peninsular War was declared by Napoleon to be at an end in April of that year. The memorial depicts the fatally wounded general still clasping his sword, supported by an almost naked muscular figure, with a third figure in uniform standing incongruously to their right. It is interesting that these memorials by two leading sculptors should be hidden away in a country parish church, reflecting, no doubt, not only the wealth of each of the families, but their connections and standing. But we should be glad that it gives us a chance to see examples of the work of these masters of their craft. One last item worthy of note is the bench which came from Hillington Hall and which has a curious carved scene on one side of two cripples, one praying and the other resting on his crutches, looking towards the church with a central steeple. There is no record of when the organ was originally installed and who built it, but we do know that it was rebuilt by W.A. Boggis of Royden in Norfolk in 1956. It has unusual hand-painted pipes, which was probably much cheaper than having an elaborate case made as a means of giving the exposed pipes a more attractive frame than we usually see with larger organs. Wolferton, the 13th century church of St. Peter in Wolferton, was also given a makeover by the Prince of Wales. It had been destroyed by fire in the 15th century, and Sir Arthur Blomfield restored it in the 1880s after rebuilding the West Newton Church of St. Peter and St. Paul. He replaced the roofs of both nave and chancel, but nothing lasts forever, and now a fundraising campaign has been launched to raise a large sum of money which is needed to repair the roof again. Blomfield discovered a damaged doom painting, that is, a medieval depiction of the Last Judgment, usually over the chancel arch, where the congregation could not fail to be reminded of their possible fate. It has unfortunately been repainted rather badly. The dado of the rood screen has 12 figures painted on, which are somewhat faint and fragmentary. One of the figures is thought to be that of St. Cibber, an Italian 13th century saint for lost keys, to whom domestic staff were inclined to pray when the need arose. Of particular note is a large triptych which has been moved to the north transept. It depicts the adoration of the Virgin by the Magi, also badly restored, but flanked by the four evangelists, looking rather better preserved. The font, with its tall, ornately carved cover, is similar to that in West Newton Church, and an embroidery of Queen Victoria's coat of arms has been restored and framed. Now, the question has been asked, did Blomfield let the quality of some of his restoration work slip below his usual standards? Perhaps he was trying to do too much, and was under pressure from the Prince of Wales, as Sir Alfred Gilbert had been. Or maybe the repainting of the two pieces just mentioned was done at a later date and not overseen by someone more knowledgeable about such work. There is a Henry Willis organ, but no date of its installation. Sadly, neither does it have an ornate case, such as another Henry Willis organ in St Nicholas Chapel, King's Lynn, which I drew in 2018. Undressed organ pipes are not very appealing aesthetically. The Church of St Lawrence at Castle Rising is the one church of the Sandringham group of parishes that was not restored by the Prince of Wales. The work had already been done by the Howard family before it became part of the group. Top architects Anthony Salvin in the 1840s and George Street in the 1850s were responsible for the tower and the main porch and most of the doorways. The original church dated back to the 1150s, when it was built by William d'Albini at the same time as his castle. The west front, which I have drawn here, is d'Albini. The font is also 12th century and is curiously surmounted by 3 ugly cat's heads, while outside there are more crude human faces with bulging eyes. It could be said that this is a church with more than its fair share of arches, dozens and dozens of them in fact. Blind arches, round elaborate Norman arches, pointed Victorian arches, arches that cross over each other, arches within arches, bricked up arches, arches with windows inset as over a small altar, and so on. The stained glass window of a vibrant angel appearing to the shepherds is attributed to the work of Shrigley and Hunt. Attractive Art Nouveau lampstands are fixed to the pew ends. The acoustics are said to be very good in this church, probably on account of the tower being positioned over the organ and the choir stalls. And finally, the Church of St Peter and St Paul at West Newton. This is the sister church of Sandringham and can be seen from St Mary Magdalene's porch. It is a pretty intimate little church and sits slightly elevated from its also much photographed Lich Gate, which stands as a poignant memorial to the men of the Sandringham estate who perished at Gallipoli during the attack in Suvla Bay on the 12th of August 1915. Their names, 16 in all, are carved on the side of the gate with that of Captain Frank Beck, MVO, who was the land agent for the estate, as his father had been, during George V's time at Sandringham, and who formed this group of volunteers attached to the 5th Battalion of the Norfolk Regiment. The church is 15th century in origin and also benefited from the many improvements that the Prince of Wales put into place. Fortuitously, a record was kept of the many gifts of items that were given by relatives or friends of the Prince. For example, Christopher Sykes, MP, mentioned earlier, donated the east window. Here again we see the work of Heaton, Butler and Bain, the stained glass designers and manufacturers who produced such striking windows for Sandringham Church. However, they had a new designer, Carl Parsons, who was associated with the arts and crafts movement and accordingly produced in 1920 an entirely different style of window. His memorial to Captain Beck is comprised of 3 lights. In the centre is a handsome figure of Captain Beck with his sword and shield. To the left is the cap badge of the Norfolk Regiment suspended in clear glass, and on the right a distant view of Suvla Bay. The style is simpler than the more filled-in scenes and figures of Heaton and Butler's pieces in Sandringham Church, but no less beautiful. They also produce the windows which feature St. Cecilia holding a portative organ, and Saints Gregory, Luke, John, and Etheldreda. The Glastonbury chair, with finely carved thorns and nails from our Lord's crucifixion that you see here, was a gift from General Sir Francis Hastings Doyle, 2nd Baronet and published poet. caricatured by Spy in Vanity Fair. Carl Parsons, who lived from 1884 to 1934, was another prolific producer of beautiful windows who liked strong colours, particularly blue and purple. Born in Peckham, he started his apprenticeship at the age of 15 and was a pupil and teacher at the Central School of Arts and Crafts from 1906 until 1927. He died prematurely from ill health and possibly overwork at the age of just 50. But he wanted it to be known that he described stained glass as the most perfect art form, which must be a vocation and should respect the traditions of the craft. One can only stand in awe of these great masterpieces by such committed and skillful artists who have brought a richness of colour to their storytelling within our churches. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Any questions from anybody? Well, just a couple of comments. Some Felix at Babington in St Margaret's Church in King's Inn Minster opposite. There is a little, on one of the windows, there's a little St Felix piece, isn't it?
Yes.
Of his ship coming into.
Oh yes, yes.
It's with it's the window with St Margaret and Bosnia, and the panel at the bottom of the window shows St Felix in his little boat coming into East Anglia, and there are lots of names after him, aren't there, Pat? I mean, apart from Felixstowe, is named after him, you know, the great container port, but there are other Felix names around, aren't there? I've always been interested in him, but I know very little.
Yes, and in the story of the beavers, which is just too fanciful for words, but yes. I don't know if you are aware that today is the Feast of All Saints, and this morning I was at Sandringham Church, and our rector was obviously talking about saints, and he said, you know, of course there are all of these saints who did amazing things and died in a horrible way often, and but he said all of us can be saints in small ways and at small in sort of small places. So it's something worth thinking about. But I thought it was a lovely what's the word I want? Coincidence that I should be telling you all about the saints depicted in the windows at Sandringham on All Saints' Day.
Yeah, very good.
Not a question, but my mother's family, traced the family tree. They were the Batesons and the Fulchers, and they lived at. They come from Pritcham, Appleton, and Pritcham and Hartley and Hillington. Actually, coming forward, the Mann family, who were one of them was a fireman at Sandringham, and it was on the bus, on the front of the bus, sort of thing. You know, they were really and I think one or two were on the memorial with Frank Beck. You know, there was
Really? And where are they buried?
My grandmother was called Hannah Fulcher. That was her name, but her father was Bates.
Do you know where they're buried?
My grandmother, I think, are buried in North Wootton. You know,
Okay.
So they killed down there.
Because we do have a list of in fact I'm working on a ground plan of the graveyard at Sandringham now, so I've got a list of all the names of people, and Frank Beck and his wife are buried at Sandringham.
Actually, with the art club, I painted the memorial at Sandringham when we went out about 2 or 3 years ago, and I painted the memorial, which is very.
It's good to look up the origins of one's family in these in these ways. Yes. Thank you.
Any others? Another link with St Margaret's is the organ, because it's a Snedstone. I think the organ in Hillington.
I've drawn that. Yes. Yes.
So Snetz is a very famous organ builder,
Yes.
18th century, a landmark in English organ building. And the one in St Margaret's is very important, isn't it, Pat?
Very, very,
Very
yes.
important. There's a little one at Hillington. The Folkes are still, I know a chap in the Brethren Society, we've got a chap called Sir Robert Folkes, and he's linked to the Folkes family. But the Folkes family, as you mentioned, at Hillington and elsewhere, very, very influential, aren't they? I mean, in West Norfolk. And they owned Hillington Square, where Hillington Square is. They owned all that land. Oh, Hillington Square. They owned all that land in London Road, and you said 4 houses.
Yes, yes. And the thing is that there were a lot of them.
Yeah.
And you would think that he was probably being a bit ambitious to decree that this, that and the other would happen within the next 1,000 years. But even so, they died without issue, or they just died out.
Yeah, the line I know, there must have been a line through, a female line, but there's a chap called Sir Robert Folkes. I don't know the exact link.
Well, that would be interesting to know.
He lives on the North Norfolk coast. Spends most of his time in Tibet with the monks. He does charity.
Even now?
Yeah, I think he's there now. He does most of, he's in a charity which operates from Tibet, and he spends most of his time there.
Does he have difficulty getting into Tibet?
No?
No. How fascinating.
He's a very nice chap.
Has he written about his time?
No, I'll have to ask him.
I mean, I would be fascinated to.
Okay.
Ever since I read the famous book by Heinrich Herrer, 7 Years in Tibet, I've been absolutely fascinated by, and in my diplomatic talks, I have drawn the old British mission in Lhasa. So I've got lots of books on Tibet. So, you know, if he's still alive and kicking and willing, I'd love to contact him. Yes.
He is, and he knows the Dalai Lama, etc. Well, thank you very much, Pat. I'll come back to thanks in a second. If, as you leave, if you've got any spare coins in your purse, as a charitable trust, we'd be very welcome to have them. You have some, of course. And thank you very much for coming and supporting us today in these very strange times. And finally, most of all, to Pat. Pat, thank you on 2 counts for giving a very interesting talk and going into, I didn't know a great deal about these churches. I knew about the families and the territory, but the churches not so much. So thank you for a very illuminating, some very good slides, very good talk indeed. And secondly, thank you for agreeing to come and speak and be filmed and so on, because you're supporting the Marriott Warehouse Trust. All we could offer you was a simple lunch.
My pleasure, and thank you very much, Paul. Unfortunately, I turned off the sound,
but
no, I'm glad I've given you some facts you probably didn't have before.
No, you
Yes.
certainly
Because he knows everything, doesn't he?
But thank you very much, Pat, for supporting us and coming today. So, thank you, Pat.